Once upon a time, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, there lived a person whose life had taken an unexpected turn. A once vibrant spirit, now dulled by the weight of loss, they spent their days moving through a haze of sadness. The spark that once lit up their smile seemed extinguished, replaced by a heavy stillness that even the cheerful chirping of birds outside their window couldn't penetrate. Friends and family tried their best to help, but the ache in their heart was one that words couldn't soothe. It felt like nothing could reach them, not the warm sun on their face, not the laughter of children playing nearby, and certainly not their own reflection in the mirror. That was until fate intervened in the form of an unexpected visitor. One gray afternoon, as the sky threatened rain, a scruffy golden retriever appeared at their doorstep. Its fur was a little matted, its paws dusty from what seemed like miles of wandering. The dog had no collar, no sign of an owner, and yet it carried an air of calm that was almost magnetic. For a moment, the two locked eyes through the window. The person hesitated, unsure whether to open the door. But something about the dog's gaze, a mix of vulnerability and quiet strength, moved them in a way they hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, they opened the door, and the dog stepped forward, wagging its tail gently as if it knew this was where it belonged. The person crouched down, and the dog leaned its head into their hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. In that moment, something shifted. It was as though the dog had brought with it a glimmer of hope, an unspoken promise that things could get better. The first night, the dog curled up on an old blanket in the corner of the living room, content and peaceful, while the person sat nearby, watching it breathe. It was the first time in months they'd felt a sense of companionship that didn't require explanations or apologies. They didn't know where the dog had come from or why it had chosen their home, but it felt like a gift they weren't ready to question. Over the weeks that followed, the dog became a constant presence, nudging them out of their routine of isolation. Morning walks became a daily ritual. At first, they stuck to short strolls around the block, but soon, they found themselves venturing further, exploring parks and trails they hadn't visited in years. The fresh air and the rhythmic sound of the dog's paws against the pavement began to chip away at the wall of sadness they'd built around themselves. What surprised them most was how the dog seemed to understand their emotions without words. On the days when the weight of grief felt unbearable, the dog would rest its head on their lap, offering a quiet comfort that no human could match. Its unconditional love and unwavering presence began to heal wounds they thought would never close. But just as life seemed to be finding its rhythm again, something happened that threatened to shatter the fragile bond they'd built. One evening, as they sat together in the park, the dog's ears perked up, its body tensing. Before they could react, it darted off into the distance, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Panic set in as they called out, their voice trembling. The emptiness that had once consumed them came rushing back, amplified by the fear of losing the one thing that had brought them light in their darkest days. And then, in the stillness of the night, they heard it, a faint bark, distant but distinct. Heart pounding, they followed the sound, not knowing what they would find, only that they couldn't lose the one who had given them a reason to hope again. Would they find the dog? And if they did, what could possibly explain the sudden departure? Stay tuned for the rest of this unforgettable story of friendship and healing. The sound of the bark echoed faintly through the still night air, growing softer with each passing moment. Their heart raced as they stumbled through the uneven terrain of the park, calling out for the dog with increasing desperation. The soft glow of the streetlights didn't reach far enough into the dense woods, and every shadow seemed to stretch and move in the darkness. The bond they'd formed with the dog over the past weeks was unlike anything they'd ever experienced, and the thought of losing it so suddenly was unbearable. Each step felt like an eternity. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the wind rustled the leaves overhead, masking the direction of the bark. They stopped for a moment, straining to hear, their breath clouding in the cool night air. Then it came again, fainter but steady, a sound that pulled them forward. The dog wasn't far, but something about the tone of its bark seemed off, almost urgent, like it was trying to get their attention or warn them of something. Their mind raced, searching for an explanation. Why had the dog run off so suddenly? What could it have seen or heard that was so important? the questions swirled, feeding a growing sense of dread. This dog wasn't just a pet, it had become a lifeline, a reason to get out of bed in the morning, to face the world again. The fear of losing it gnawed at them, a sharp reminder of how fragile hope could be. As they pushed deeper into the park, the trees thickened, and the darkness became more oppressive. They tripped over a root and fell to their knees, scraping their hands on the rough ground. Tears of frustration welled up, but they quickly wiped them away. This wasn't the time to give up. They had to find the dog. Pulling themselves up, they pressed on, focusing on the faint sound that guided them like a beacon. Finally, they spotted a glimmer of movement ahead. The dog stood near the base of a large tree, its body tense, tail still, and ears pricked. It barked again, a short, sharp sound that sent shivers down their spine. Relief flooded through them at the sight of the dog, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. What was it staring at so intently? As they approached, the dog glanced back at them briefly, as if to make sure they were coming, before turning its attention back to the shadows. They followed the dog's gaze and noticed something unusual, a faint outline of what appeared to be an old, weathered structure partially hidden by the dense underbrush. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, its walls covered in moss and vines, with shattered windows reflecting the faint moonlight. Their breath caught. They hadn't realized there was anything like this in the park, and they'd walked these paths countless times before. The dog took a step forward, its nose to the ground, sniffing intently as if it were tracking something. They hesitated, a mix of curiosity and unease taking hold. What could have drawn the dog here? The dog let out another low bark and turned to look at them, its eyes glinting in the dim light. It wasn't just a bark of alarm, it felt almost like a call, an invitation to follow. They swallowed hard, their pulse quickening. Every instinct told them to turn back, to leave whatever mystery lay ahead undiscovered. But the thought of ignoring the dog's plea felt wrong, like breaking a trust that had formed between them. Gathering their courage, they took a step closer to the structure. The air felt colder here, heavy with a strange stillness that made their skin prickle. The dog led the way, moving carefully but deliberately, pausing every few steps to make sure they were following. As they approached the doorway, which hung crookedly on rusted hinges, the faint scent of damp earth and decay filled the air. Inside, the shadows deepened, and their eyes struggled to adjust. The dog moved ahead, its claws clicking softly against the floor, which was littered with leaves and debris. Their voice trembled as they called out softly, more for their own reassurance than anything else. The dog paused, its ears twitching, before it let out another bark, this one quieter, almost as if it were speaking to the silence. They reached into their pocket and pulled out their phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing broken furniture, scattered papers, and the remnants of what might have once been a home or small shelter. The air felt charged, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting. The dog sniffed the ground intently, then stopped near a small pile of rags and old blankets in the corner. It barked again, softer this time, and nudged the pile with its nose. Their heart pounded as they stepped closer, crouching down to see what the dog had found. At first, it looked like nothing more than a heap of discarded cloth, but then they noticed a faint movement, a subtle rise and fall, almost imperceptible. They leaned in, their breath catching as they realized what it was. A small figure, barely more than a bundle of fragile limbs, lay curled beneath the blankets. It was a child, no older than 5 or 6, their face pale and drawn, their body shivering even beneath the layers of fabric. Their eyes fluttered open, filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion, and locked onto the dog. The dog whined softly, lying down beside the child and resting its head near theirs, as if to offer warmth and reassurance. For a moment, everything else faded, the darkness, the cold, the fear, and all they could see was the connection between the dog and the child, a silent bond that transcended words. They fumbled for their phone, their hands shaking as they dialed for help. The operator's voice was calm and steady, guiding them through what to do until emergency services arrived. They draped their jacket over the child, speaking softly, trying to offer comfort, even as questions swirled in their mind. Who was this child? How had they ended up here? And why had the dog been so determined to lead them to this spot? As the sound of distant sirens grew louder, the dog nudged the child gently, its tail wagging ever so slightly. It was as if the dog knew that help was on the way, that its mission was almost complete. But for the person who had followed the dog into the night, the journey was far from over. This moment raised more questions than it answered, and the sense of mystery lingered like the chill in the air. What had drawn the dog to this child, and what story lay behind those frightened eyes? As the flashing lights of the ambulance pierced the darkness, one thing was clear: the connection between the dog and the people it touched was far deeper than they could have imagined. And as they watched the paramedics carefully lift the child, they couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were all about to change in ways they couldn't yet understand. The ambulance lights painted the trees in flashing reds and blues as the paramedics worked swiftly to assess the child. The air buzzed with urgency, but amidst the chaos, the dog stayed calm, its eyes never leaving the child. As the paramedics wrapped the child in a thermal blanket and gently lifted them onto a stretcher, the dog let out a low whine, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The person stood back, their emotions swirling relief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the dog who had brought them here. The child's frail voice barely rose above a whisper as they clutched at the blanket, looking toward the dog. "The dog found me," they murmured before drifting off into sleep. The paramedics exchanged puzzled glances, but there was no time for questions as they secured the child in the ambulance. One of them turned to the person and asked if they wanted to ride along to the hospital, but their gaze fell to the dog, who was sitting quietly by their side. They shook their head, deciding to stay with the dog. Something told them this wasn't the end of the story. After the ambulance disappeared into the distance, the park fell silent again. The dog turned and began walking away, back toward the familiar paths they had taken so many times together. It was as if the dog was guiding them home again, and they followed, their mind racing with questions. Who was this child? How had they ended up in the park, and why had the dog known exactly where to find them? The answers felt just out of reach, tangled in the same mystery that had brought the dog to their doorstep weeks ago. The next morning, the hospital called with an update. The child was stable, though weak and malnourished. Authorities had been contacted, and an investigation was underway to piece together what had happened. They learned that the child had been missing for several days, and their survival in the cold, dark park seemed almost impossible until the dog's intervention. The connection between the dog and the child wasn't just coincidence, it felt like destiny. Days turned into weeks, and while the child recovered and slowly began to share fragments of their story, one piece of the puzzle remained elusive: the dog. Every time the person tried to explain the dog's behavior, how it had led them to the child, how it seemed to know exactly what was needed, they came up short. It was more than instinct. It was as if the dog carried a purpose, a mission that defied explanation. Then came the twist they never saw coming. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the dog resting at their feet, a knock came at the door. A young woman stood there, her face pale but her eyes filled with hope. She explained that she had seen a photo of the dog, shared by the hospital staff who were still marveling at its heroics. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt and called the dog by a name the person had never heard before. To their astonishment, the dog immediately perked up, its tail wagging furiously as it rushed to the woman, nuzzling her with unmistakable recognition. The woman explained that the dog had been hers, a loyal companion she had lost months ago when it had run off during a family outing in the same park. She had searched tirelessly, but the dog had vanished without a trace. The person listened in stunned silence as the woman shared her story, and it became clear that the dog had somehow found its way to the child, guided by an unseen force they couldn't comprehend. It was as if the dog had left one home to find another, and in doing so, had become the bridge between two broken lives. As the woman prepared to take the dog home, the person felt a pang of sadness but also a deep sense of closure. The dog had come into their life at a time when they needed it most, bringing healing and purpose. It had stayed long enough to guide them out of the darkness and into the light. And now, it was time for the dog to continue its journey. But just as the woman turned to leave, the dog hesitated. It looked back at the person, its eyes filled with something that felt like understanding. It nudged the woman's hand and then trotted back to the person, resting its head against their knee. The woman smiled softly and said, "It seems like this dog has chosen you, too." And so, in an unexpected twist of fate, the dog stayed a companion not bound by ownership but by a bond that transcended words. The child continued to recover, the woman found solace in knowing the dog was safe, and the person began to live again, their heart no longer heavy with grief. Together, they all became part of a story that would be told for years to come, a story of love, healing, and the unbreakable connection between a dog and the people it saved. It was a story that didn't need explanation, because sometimes, the best things in life simply are. The dog stayed. It was a decision made not by logic or planning but by the unspoken bond that had formed between the three of them: the dog, the person, and the child. Life began to settle into a quiet rhythm, one filled with small but meaningful steps forward. The child, now living safely under the care of relatives found through the authorities, started visiting regularly. Each time they arrived, their eyes would light up at the sight of the dog, who greeted them with an enthusiasm that spoke volumes about their unique connection. The person found themselves stepping into a role they never anticipated, a bridge between the child's fragile recovery and the stable, loving environment they needed. They listened as the child slowly opened up about their past, their words halting but brave. It turned out that the child had been wandering for days, lost after a series of events too painful for someone so young to process. The dog had found them during a stormy night, staying by their side and keeping them warm until help arrived. With each visit, the child grew stronger, their laughter becoming a regular soundtrack to afternoons spent playing fetch with the dog in the park. The person began to see the world through the child's eyes, a world that still held wonder and hope, even after so much hardship. It was a reminder that healing wasn't just about mending what was broken, it was about finding joy in the small things, the things that make life worth living. The woman who had come looking for the dog also became a recurring part of their lives. Though she had initially planned to take the dog home, she soon realized that its bond with the person and the child was too deep to sever. Instead, she became a friend, a connection to the dog's past and a part of its future. She shared stories of the adventures she and the dog had experienced together, painting a picture of a loyal companion who had always had an uncanny ability to sense when someone needed comfort. One sunny afternoon, as they all sat together in the park, the woman revealed something that tied the story together in an unexpected way. She had adopted the dog years ago from a shelter, where it had been brought in as a stray. The staff at the shelter had told her it had a history of wandering to find people who needed help, stories of hikers lost on trails or families in distress who had been guided back to safety by this seemingly ordinary golden retriever. Hearing this, the person felt a shiver run down their spine. It explained so much about dogs' actions, its instinct to lead, its calm but purposeful demeanor. This dog wasn't just any dog, it was a guardian, a presence that seemed to defy explanation. They looked at the dog, now lying peacefully in the grass, and felt a swell of gratitude that words couldn't fully capture. As time passed, life continued to move forward in its unpredictable way. The child, now living with their relatives full-time, began to thrive. They joined a local soccer team, their confidence growing with each goal scored and each cheer from the sidelines. The person attended their games whenever they could, the dog always by their side, wagging its tail enthusiastically with every win. The woman, who had once been a stranger, became a close friend. She started a small community initiative inspired by the dog story, focusing on connecting shelter animals with people in need of companionship and healing. The project brought together families, veterans, and individuals who had experienced loss, all finding solace in love and loyalty of rescue animals. The person volunteered to help, sharing their own story and watching as the dog's influence rippled outward, touching lives in ways they hadn't imagined. Through it all, the dog remained a constant, a reminder of how much could change when love and trust were given freely. Its presence had transformed a life filled with grief into one of purpose and connection. The person often thought back to the day the dog had first appeared at their doorstep, a scruffy stranger who had somehow known exactly where to go.